I just wanted to say a few introductory words so that you know where to place Ralf Fücks and also why he's here. And that, of course, well, I don't know really why you are here, but I know why I wanted you to be here. As you know from the Colloque Lippmann and from the notes that you have received, the colloque was named after Walter Lippmann because he had produced this book which made everybody question the liberal approach. His role at the colloquium in Paris in 1938 was to give his comments and contributions, etc. But on the first night he gave an opening speech, quite long speech, in which he sort of stirred everybody up by saying where the trouble was. And in this, I think he was very influential and he had a good set of questions. I will give you two little quotes just to get into the spirit of the organizers who found this very remarkable. For example, you must imagine that we are now on the evening of August 26th. The weather is almost like that. And Lippmann says, "We will not accomplish anything if we let ourselves think and if we give the impression that our goal is only to reaffirm and to resuscitate the formulas of 19th century liberalism," or 20th for us. And he was calling for a fundamental revision of all our ideas, and he said that we should reserve ourselves the right to revise the premises of all liberal theories and to grant none of them a dogmatic and definitive value. So I thought we needed somebody who was able to do something like that tonight. And poor Ralf Fücks is terribly embarrassed by that. But I do think that he can do that in a very charming way, of course. He is the co-director of the Center for Liberal Modernity, and that's his program, actually. It's about liberalism, but it's about modernity. Liberalism not in a very old-fashioned way, and you will find out what it means. He has a background in the social sciences, in economics and history, and he has been a member of the Green Party from the early 80s. You know that the Greens in Germany were created in 1980. He joined in 82, so he's been a long member. In 1991, he became a senator for urban development and protection of the environment in the city of Bremen in the north of Germany, a city of which he was the mayor mayor, I think, from 93 to 95. In 97, moving on to the political circus in Berlin, he became the director of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, which is an independent foundation, which is, however, very close to the Green Party. And he's been a public intellectual in that position for many years and has always sought to establish a dialogue, a conversation with political forces from all sides, especially from liberal thinking people. So he has ideas about liberalism and the necessity to ask where liberals have failed and where we might have blind spots and what it is that we might have to think about in a fresh and new way. He has published a book that I would recommend to everybody if only it was translated into English. I hope that will happen one day. He is nodding. Great.
Next spring.
Next spring. Lovely. So the title of that book will probably be what in English?
Defending Freedom.
Defending Freedom. Yes. Okay. I've read this book with joy and you can gather very many impulses from that. So I do think we are lucky to have him here.
Liberalism is in trouble. And anti-liberal counter-movements are afoot around the globe. Authoritarian populists are seizing power in more and more countries. And I wouldn't compare the current situation. It was, of course, the 30s, 38. It was really a time of despair. I think we are quite in a different position. There's no reason for despair, but there is reason to be worried and to be in alarm and to be, I would say, determined. I would like to compare our current situation with the 25 years ago, 89, 90. And probably most of you still can remember the feelings, the emotions of these years. You know, this huge wave of liberty, of these democratic break-free movements, especially in Central Eastern Europe, but all over the world. And of course, this famous Fukuyama moment when he stated the end of history, which of course didn't mean nothing will happen no more, but there will be no systemic competition anymore. This was the meaning of the end of history. The final victory of the combination of liberal political systems and market economies, or capitalism, liberal capitalism. This is now the main road, the highway. The rest of the world will follow in different speeds. And this has then occurred as a fundamental historical error. Today we are facing a double challenge to liberal democracies. Externally, from more and more self-assertive authoritarian powers, which don't see themselves any longer as a kind of transitional society from a totalitarian past to a democratic future. No, they see themselves as a kind of counter-model and adversary to liberal democracies. And this is not mainly about Russia or Iran, and meanwhile also Turkey. It is very much about China. China is the main challenge to liberal democracies, because China has managed to combine characteristics which in former times we doubt would fit together. Authoritarianism, very almost totalitarian kind of rule, with a very dynamic economy and social progress on a large scale. So the promise of China is innovation, stability, and prosperity without democracy. And democracy in the China narrative, this is chaos, this is ineffectivity. It's a kind of the ancient world. And they are portraying themselves as kind of the new modern, the new modern. And I think this is the most fundamental challenge to liberal democracies. I will come back to that at the end, that we are in a new kind of systemic competition, not necessarily in the old ideological way, but in a competition with respect to output legitimacy. Output legitimacy. It's not longer only about input legitimacy. It's about output legitimacy. And the second major challenge, of course, you know it all, is from within, from the very core of the Western democratic societies. Brexit was the first blow. The election of Donald Trump, of course, the second one. And then this series of right-wing populist, nationalist, xenophobic parties getting stronger all over Europe, from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean and from the Atlantic to the east. And the coming up of a new term, the illiberal democracy, as the new role model Orban, and also in Poland you have similar tendencies. But meanwhile, the virus jumped to Western Europe too. With, if you're looking to Austria or to Italy, these are illiberal governments. And in Germany, at both ends of the political spectrum, we have a not very outspoken but deep-rooted anti-liberal tradition on the very right and on the very left. And this is also a kind of characteristic of the current situation, that the old left-right divide, it's still existing in a certain dimension, but it's no longer the defining conflict. The defining conflict now is not left and right. It is about open and societies or closed. It is about internationalism and nationalism. It's about diversity or this kind of homogeneous ethnical definition of political nations, of nations. And when Christian Lindner, the leader of the German Liberal Party, the FDP, is speaking about political liberalism, it sounds like if he were talking about a defined little minority. And if others are speaking of his party, it's as the Germans here in the room will know it, the former singer-songwriter Franz Josef Degenhardt coined it, don't play with the dirty kids and don't sing their songs. Don't sing their songs. So liberalism almost globally has become a kind of fringe phenomenon. And this in spite that we owe liberalism much of our modern achievements. The principle of universal human rights, the idea of individual self-determination, the foundations of our democratic republic, government by the people and for the people, free elections, rule of law, the protection of minorities, the independence of the judiciary, freedom of the press, and last not least, a dynamic economy based on entrepreneurship, competition, and open markets. This combination of liberal political systems and capitalist market economies has afforded us an up to now unknown degree of assurance of justice, of individual liberties, and economic prosperity. And it has created or brought up an really unprecedented human progress over the last 200 years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Just to mention one figure, life expectancy has doubled since the beginning of the 19th century. The average life expectancy was around about 37 years. Now it has doubled globally. And at the same time, the global population has increased from 1 billion to 7.2 or 7.3 billion people. Well, this is enormous progress, and especially since 1999, when we had experienced a new accelerated wave of globalization, this progress spread from the highly industrial countries to the former third world, to the developing countries. The number of people living in extreme poverty has been cut by 50% since 1990, from 2 billion to 1 billion. And at the same time, the global population grew by more than 2 billion people. Also, the level of education and women's rights in almost all criteria this the liberal order has brought an enormous progress to the world. But yet, how did liberalism manage to fall into disrepute in spite of these historical merits? Usually, if you ask this then questions, people are quick to point to neoliberalism, even though, and you will be familiar with that, neoliberalism thought stems from very different historical roots as an alternative to totalitarian systems. It is often equated with market radicalism today. And its mantra of deregulation, privatization, and tax cuts for the upper class has indeed weakened public institutions. Deregulation of financial markets fueled the deep crisis of 2007 and 2008, which in my view has been kind of the mother of all crises, especially in Europe. And it has been discrediting globalization deeply. The growing low-wage sector, precarious work arrangements, a crass disparity of wealth, and organized tax avoidance by international corporations have created a constant ambient noise that is buzzing with a notion of injustice, a notion of injustice. And in the eyes of the broader public, liberalism seems to turn a blind eye to the social question. It sides with the successful rather than with those who struggle. And it's no coincidence that the German FDP is still struggling with its self-proclaimed label of being the party of high-income earners, an inexcusable, arrogant brand a former leader of the party reclaimed for his squad. The liberal camp, and I'm using this term in its European tradition, which is different from the specific meaning of liberal in the US, also offers few convincing solutions concerning the threat to the ecosystems on which our human civilization depends: climate, soils, and oceans. And while the caveats of an ecological nanny state are legitimate, liberals discredit themselves when they downplay the urgency of ecological transition. Liberalism has yet to write a playbook for an ecological policy that reconciles climate protection with a dynamic market economy, sustainable economic growth, and diversity of lifestyles. Calling for a global, at least all European progressive CO2 tax is fine, but no surrogate to a more complex and differentiated ecological policy. And neglecting the ecological challenge is especially counterproductive if you look into the younger generation. Then a lot of the young ones, they are really not only concerned, they are highly mobilized by the ecological challenges. And for them, this is a core question in which political direction they go. Beyond poor political performance on certain areas, there are deeper reasons why liberal politics is on the defensive. Classic liberalism avoids the question how to maintain social cohesion beyond the invisible hand of the market. Too many liberals' catchwords such as solidarity or community have a suspicious collectivist ring, as does the notion of the welfare state. They consider redistribution the work of the devil, a violation of the inherent beauty and perfection of market economies. The avant-gardes of liberal thought deliberately decline to make grand future projections. Their objective is to keep the future open. It will emerge from the free play of the forces at work, from the sum of individual decisions made by a myriad of actors. So liberal politics is all about trial and error, about reform rather than revolution, about quiet doubt rather than blustering certainty, about competition, about the best solution rather than proclaiming grand ideas about how the future is to be arranged. And this is wise and humane. But sheer pragmatism, however, falls short. In times of growing uncertainty, a solid concept for the future is essential. Who do people trust to best master the challenges of globalization and digital revolution, of climate change and global migration? How should the future of work look like, and how to ensure social cohesion of ever more diverse and fragmented societies? Populists from the left and right are steering strong emotions: fear, hatred, pride, nationalism, making the champions of liberal democracy look a little bit anemic in comparison to them. While constitutional patriotism, a term coined by Jürgen Habermas, the famous German philosopher, is a good idea, it remains an abstract construct. The democratic republic is more than the sum of its institutions. It relies on joint action by its citizens, on negotiating common goals. And that won't work without a notion of what we want for our future. Liberalism must not focus on individual liberty alone. It should offer a convincing idea of public freedom too. Anxiety about the future is the mental soundboard of authoritarians. In opposition to them, we need confidence that we can create a better future rather than dread it as a doomed fate that will inevitably roll over us. In a time of turbulent change, people feel an increased need for security and solidarity, for finding assurance in communities. Nationalists promise social and emotional security by retreating into the confines of our national state and ethnic community as a bulwark against the storms raging outside. And liberalism will only be able to emerge from its defensive corner if it can respond to these basically conservative needs for security and identity and formulate liberal answers to these needs. When Emmanuel Macron is speaking of a Europe that protects, he is hitting a nerve. And it's not about protection or not, it's about the kind then of protection. Liberals should not portray themselves as anti-regulation. Instead, they should be champions of smart regulation. Economic globalization needs to be embedded in a social and ecological framework. Global migration needs to be regulated too. Openness towards technological innovation needs a minimum of individual ability to keep pace with new technologies. And of course, this is very much about public education, as well as a minimum of social security to cushion the fallout from disruptive transformation. The mother of all liberties is freedom from fear. Those who live in fear of social failure are not free. Real-life freedom also means to be able to move in the public space unafraid. Those who neglect public safety and order are tilling the ground for authoritarian populists. It's not enough to keep our love of freedom and the defense of liberal values. Modern liberalism must bridge seeming dichotomies between freedom and safety, between individuality and solidarity, diversity and identity, cosmopolitanism and patriotism, between economic dynamics and ecological responsibility. It must shed its habits of simply pitting the market versus the state and appreciate the importance of public institutions in upholding equal liberty for all. Markets rely on prerequisites they cannot generate on their own. An assurance of justice, social peace, protection of the natural resources that assure our livelihood, a functional set of rules governing competition, a strong science and educational system, and a modern infrastructure. None of this is free. The slogan, smaller government is better, is just as misleading as its opposite. In a nutshell, we need a renewal of liberalism that offers both liberty and security. We must deliver on the liberal promise of equal opportunities and upward social mobility. And we must develop a new notion of progress that is more than just a continuation of the status quo. Our confidence that liberal democracy is the more successful, more innovative, and more just system is in peril. It's not enough to defend our values. Finally, it's time to deliver. Thank you very much.